Welcome to the MAPS Podcast. Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Hello friends, welcome to the MAPS Podcast. This is Zach Leary, your host. I am the host of this podcast, which deals in explorations in consciousness in relationship to the modern psychedelic renaissance. And if you're curious about what I'm up to, go to zachleary.net and you'll see some of the programs and events that I'm a part of. But yes, this is episode 45 of the show, and on this episode we have our very own Betty Aldworth. Yes, she is the Director of Communications and Events for MAPS, and prior to that she was the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So she's just had years and years of experience in this world and really guided me in this interview on the topic of psychedelic exceptionalism, which really opened my eyes in so many ways. So I encourage everyone to listen to that interview with an open heart and mind, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And as usual, please visit maps.org to sign yourself up to become a regular member of MAPS by donating to the wonderful work that the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies does. Your donations really go directly to all the science and research, the clinical trials, the advancement of policy on a state and federal level, all really, really important. And in 2000, and we're going to be saying this pretty much every time, but I won't get into the whole spiel, but 2023, the Psychedelic Science Conference will be held in Denver, Colorado from June 18th to the 25th. Lots more information over the coming months is going to be announced regarding that. Tickets, links to apply for if you want to be on a panelist or a speaker, all of those kinds of things. And there is some new stuff on maps.org, which I really encourage you to check out. If you go to maps.org and click on store, you will see all of this good psychedelic swag. Psychedelic Research Department unisex t-shirts. This thing, which is actually my favorite, is the Psychedelic Research Department eye mask. And for all of you who are veteran psychonaut subjects in the therapeutic world know how important the eye mask plays to in this whole part of the puzzle. It's very, very cool. So go to maps.org and click on store for that. What else? I announced this last time on the last episode, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. MAPS has announced their new co-publishing relationship with Synergetic Press. The partnership will greatly expand the availability of education about psychedelic therapy. Synergetic Press has been a leading publisher of cutting-edge books in the field of psychedelics and consciousness, and this collaboration will make these authors' knowledge more accessible to a broader world market. Rick Doblin said, now that the psychedelic renaissance has overcome political obstacles in research, public education is the most important need. So this dissemination of stories, research in the form of books, and this partnership is just a great way for us to get the word out, share our stories, talk about the research, share the data, and share our experiences. So before we get into the episode with Betty, I wanted to play something from Dr. Carl Hart, who just wrote the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups. The whole talk about psychedelic exceptionalism really had me thinking a lot about Carl's work, because he doesn't talk just about psychedelics exclusively. He talks about a myriad of mind and mood altering substances and how the cultural biases against their use in our lives and how the data has just been perverted to the point of creating a lot of false narratives. So, let's listen to this from Dr. Carl Hart for a couple minutes.
We started to use the term marijuana mainly to associate it with Mexican Americans in an effort to vilify the drug, because cannabis had been around forever and many Americans were familiar with the effects of cannabis. And so you couldn't make these incredible stories up about cannabis itself, but really they're the same thing. I'm Carl Hart, professor in the departments of psychiatry and psychology at Columbia University. I study the effects of drugs in people. There's so much misunderstanding about drugs, particularly recreational drugs. And today I'd like to clear up some of the information and debunk many of the myths that many people hold. Marijuana is a gateway drug. When we say gateway drug, we mean that using marijuana will cause someone to go on to use so-called harder drugs like cocaine or heroin. When we think about the people who use heroin, more of those people have used marijuana beforehand. That's certainly true. But when we look at marijuana users in total, the vast majority of marijuana users do not go on to use cocaine or heroin or any other drug. So this notion that marijuana is a gateway drug confuses correlation with causation. Correlation are just variables that may go together. If it's raining outside, you may see more umbrellas that go up than when it's not raining. And that's a correlation between umbrellas and rainfall. But no one would say the umbrellas are causing the rain. That's correlation. Causation is when you have a variable that causes another variable. For example, the last three presidents of the United States, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama, all smoked marijuana when they were young men. It would be like saying that marijuana is a gateway drug to the White House. It's not true. That's the difference between correlation and causation. We know for sure that marijuana is not a gateway drug because the vast majority of marijuana smokers never go on to using any other drugs. If it was a gateway drug, then we would have the majority, if not all, going on to try harder drugs.
Dr. Carl Hart. I highly encourage you to check out the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups. That was just one little snippet of a lot of the things that Carl is talking about out there in the greater media sphere. He really tackles some of these subjects where, quite honestly, I feel like the plot has been lost over the years and misinformation has morphed into public hysteria, which has turned into poor education, and so many people grow up really believing the wrong things about a lot of these substances that play a role in so many lives of people across the globe. So just wanted to share that with you for a little bit. But the podcast, let's get into it. Let's get into the interview. Betty Oldworth, Director of Communications and Events for MAPS. Prior to that, Betty was the Executive Director for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, where she led and supported tens of thousands of students and young people united to build a more sensible future through reforming drug policies that are rooted in safety, justice, and education. Our talk was wide-ranging, but we really started off with the whole concept of psychedelic exceptionalism, which quite honestly is something that I really needed to learn a lot more about, and I still do. So after you listen to this interview, I really encourage you to check where you're at with this, because it is important, and it really has a lot to do with the future of psychedelics and all mind and mood altering compounds. So here we go, Betty Aldworth. Betty, thank you so much for joining the MAPS podcast. It's great to be with you.
Well, Zach, I'm thrilled. A year to the day. I think this will post on my MAPS anniversary.
Oh, great.
Yeah. When I first joined the team at MAPS as a consultant, so I'm delighted to be on the podcast with you today.
Fantastic. And I think I'm pretty sure this is true. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that with the exception of Rick, you're the only other person who's actually working with MAPS and has been on the podcast, and it's a great thing. So the perspective that you can share from within and without is really important for the listeners. So there's so many things to talk to you about. I mean, your history in this culture, not just in psychedelics, but in drug policy and drug culture as a whole is vast, and there's probably almost too much to get into there. But I wanted to start with what we call psychedelic exceptionalism. And I know this topic is near and dear to your heart. First, tell us what it is, what that means.
Sure. So psychedelic exceptionalism is this notion that psychedelics as substances are somehow inherently superior, better than other drugs, as opposed to thinking of all drugs, whether that be psychedelics or opioids, stimulants, caffeine, alcohol, sugar, as simply tools that we use in different ways to achieve human ends. And when we're thinking about psychedelic exceptionalism and how it affects community, our psychedelic community and communities at large, the important thing to keep in mind is that when we decide that some drugs are inherently better than others, what we're really doing is deciding that some people who use drugs are inherently better than others.
Right.
And we're continuing to stigmatize and other people who use drugs that we don't care for or find distasteful or find or think of as different than psychedelics. Right. And we saw a lot of this in the cannabis space early on, still do, of course. And you know, the danger there is that we continue to perpetuate the human rights abuses of the war on drugs.
Right. Which kind of led me to this thought that, you know, I think a lot of people within the psychedelic community at large don't really even know, aren't even aware that they're perpetuating this separation, you know, this kind of illusion, or this not illusion, but this actual separation within the war on drugs, and somehow some drugs are better than others. This drug is a medicine, this drug is a hard drug, and so on and so forth. And some people are really, you know, probably well-intentioned because psychedelics may have had a singular impact on their life through just one use, perhaps, that really just blew their mind. So they kind of look at it with this revelatory kind of sense of wonder. But how did we get here? And some question, how can we as a community stop this gap from widening?
Yeah, you know, I think it's the how did we get here question is such an interesting one, because it is sort of human nature to create team, right? You build your team, people who think like you, look like you, believe like you. And so we connect with other people who have had similar experiences with psychedelics. And by nature, you know, think of people who, you know, our brain sorts people into categories of people who use drugs, people who don't use drugs, people who, you know, use psychedelics and don't. And so my best guess is that we got here through our natural instinct toward team building, right? Community building. And the thing that we need to remember, right, is that we are all here on the same team. The war on drugs itself has been built over decades to make all of us who use drugs other. Yeah, from people who use only legally and socially acceptable drugs. And if we are, I think that the ways to get out of it is to, end the delusion that we have that all psychedelic use is positive use, that all stigmatized drug use is negative use, and to really understand substances as tools with which we have relationships, right? That's all any substances. We've seen people with chaotic, we all know someone who's had a chaotic or undesired relationship with any substance that's out there, right? Even if we try to say, oh, well, it was just a little while when he was doing a little too much acid, or, or if we try to excuse it away, right? Like, if we think about it critically, most of us can identify a time in our own lives or in the life of someone close to us where their relationship with a substance that we like to think of as inherently positive in the psychedelic ecosystem as being a negative one. And listen, we all know about that, first year or so after someone becomes introduced to psychedelics, and they go through their, that phase of proselytization and
sure, of
extreme positive experience, right? Sometimes, like, there are some problems with that phase. So let's acknowledge that, right? So I think shedding the wool from our eyes about this notion that drugs in and of themselves have these inherent qualities.
Right.
And now that is, that does not by any means address the complications of spiritual use plants that are sort of exist in a realm that is I'm not an expert on, and I think that if we want to talk about that might be a different kind of conversation. But if we're talking about the social and political policy implications, then I think it's very clear that we need to remember this. Now, there was a study that came out some number of years ago that demonstrated that people who used psilocybin tended to be more ecologically minded, right? Yeah. They got greener. And my question to that is, if psilocybin can cause you to love a tree more, why can't it cause you to love a human more who might happen to be using a drug that you find distasteful?
And someone like Carl Hart did this one category and looked at it holistically, like Carl is doing. Is this possible?
There's no question that we have the opportunity and should take it right now to expand as a psychedelic community our notion of who is the sort of person who might use psychedelics and who is the sort of person who might use stigmatized drugs. And you might have noticed that I'm making a distinction here between psychedelics and stigmatized drugs. A few years ago, I would have grouped psychedelics into the category of stigmatized drugs. And while we're still on the road, there's no question that psychedelics have sort of separated themselves from the pack, if you will, alongside cannabis. And that's where this exceptionalism starts to come in. But the opportunity right now to recognize that that any substance, again, is a tool and might be used in any number of different ways. I think that we forget very often that opioids were first opium, which was used primarily for medical purposes, right? And so this medical designation doesn't distinguish psychedelics from cocaine, from amphetamines, from opium, from opioids, right? the various designations that we place on it. And Carl himself, at a conference, a MAPS conference in Austin in 2019, explained to the audience that, hey, you say that psychedelics open your mind and saved your life. Heroin did that for me. Right. And we need to acknowledge that his experience is real for him, and probably not just for him.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. We look at, we hear so often in talking about psilocybin, that we're always talking about indigenous cultures have been using it for thousands of years. All true. But same with the opium trade routes have been, we're along the South Pacific and Mideast trade routes for thousands and thousands of years, and were a huge part of the global economy until really ultimately not that long ago. Right. So, but it's still, I'm a recovering substance abuse person, and for some reason, I sort of feel like all sides of this issue are true for me. And that opiates, or say crack cocaine, are perhaps more inherently dangerous for me, but I need to look at it, through a singular lens, as that is just my experience, right? So how, I don't know. I mean, what's the answer?
Yeah, well, anybody who's listened to any podcast that I've been on probably will be unsurprised to hear me say, volunteering is a great place to start. There is almost certainly a harm reduction center in your community that is serving people who are using stigmatized drugs. They are often referred to as needle exchanges, but they're providing a lot of additional services. If you're lucky enough to be in Vancouver or Canada broadly, you will be able to find an overdose prevention facility or a safe injection facility. And, spending some time reading what your local community is writing about what's happening in their world right now, connecting with that harm reduction facility, and spending some time volunteering, getting to know other people. There's no better way to understand others than to have a conversation with them. Right? Yeah. If that's daunting, pick up Carl's book. Carl's book, Drug Use for Grownups, is just an incredible explication of all of these different topics that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And really get educated about the real risks and potential benefits of these substances, right? I mean, fundamentally, ending prohibition and creating a space where regulated substances are sensibly and appropriately placed in our society and held in relationship comes down to having a deep understanding of the real risks and potential benefits and the ways that they actually impact people in their lives. So get to know that, right? There's a lot that we can do, even, from our couches on our computers, to learn about how these substances can impact people. And Zach, for me too, it's highly personal. When I was 19, I had a very undesirable, in retrospect, and undesired relationship with methamphetamine, and spent 6 months in a where methamphetamine was in charge of our relationship, right? And that was highly problematic for me. And I, from 20 to 42, didn't touch amphetamines at all. And at 42 received a diagnosis of ADHD. And which explained a lot. Yes. And, I use Adderall healthfully in a way that is extremely helpful for my life, not just my productivity, but also my mental health. And that is a fundamentally different relationship with that substance that I had such a problem with when I was younger. That is one example out of thousands, many thousands of people who live this experience that we're talking about right now with understanding substances in relationship to, as tools in relationship.
Right. Right. And when I hear that story, and I was just thinking about my own too, it just reminds me of like, when I was a teenager, my dad would say to me all the time, and of course I did not believe him. I was a rebellious teenager and thought he was being an onerous, egregious father who was being a hypocrite.
Even with your dad.
Yeah. And he was saying, Zach, you're too young to be using these things. Trust me, your mind is not fully developed yet. You're not going to get the full benefits of it yet. Wait until you have more life experience and your brain is fully developed. And so when I hear stories of this, I kind of think that, so much of this, like the harm we see on an individual level has so much to do with youth, people who are miseducated, who aren't prepared to use these substances. And later on, when you have more life experience, more knowledge, and perhaps a real applicable use for whatever the substance is, that there's some hope there, there's some benefit, right?
Well, sure. And listen, we've all been misguided youth at one point in our lives, right? But fundamentally, it's about education.
It's about education, yes.
And really understanding, what your desired outcome is, intention, right? And integration, absolutely. Whether it's psychedelics or, something that you're getting at the pharmacy counter or heroin or whatever it might be.
Right.
Intention, education, and making sure that you're, my daily integration doesn't necessarily look the same from,
when you were 19.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which was probably not at all, but every day I think about what impact is cannabis having in my life? What impact is Adderall having? Is this something that I want? Is this working for me and serving me? And that's always the question that we need to be asking ourselves, I think, in order to build that sort of healthful relationship. And listen, you've had loads of people on your show who are far more expert in the practices of this than I, but as a lay person who spent a lot of time thinking about this, even before I entered the world of cannabis or psychedelics, I was very closely investigating, starting in my late 20s, my own relationships with substances, and I've quit sugar plenty of times. I probably need to again.
It's the hardest one to do for me.
Ooh, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
I've had to moderate my relationship with alcohol and caffeine at various points, and because they weren't serving me in that moment. So how do I fix that? And that's really the question that we need to ask ourselves, no matter what the substance.
So when, over the course of the next few years, we're already starting to see it, but with the change in psychedelics within our culture and at a policy level, when we start seeing psychedelics kind of move on from clinical trial phases to actual prescriptions in real world case studies and seeing those numbers increase, what do you think we're going to learn from that, and from a scientific level, but also from a policy level? How do you think that's going to inform policy?
One of the most interesting facets of this for me is just how striking it is when we look at these studies. The MAP1 study that we released in May, the studies that are coming out about cannabis and so many others, how very distant our national and global drug policies are from reality, right? The Schedule I substances are supposed to be those which have no medical benefit and a high risk of addiction.
Right.
Now,
and cannabis is still on it.
And cannabis is still on it. Yeah. Right. Insane. Absolutely. Right. It doesn't make any kind of sense whatsoever. And I think that we need to really interrogate the structure of the Controlled Substances Act right? Really look at how do substances end up in those schedules and why? And so I'm hoping that, through this continued, the continued invalidation of the scheduling for cannabis, psychedelics, and probably very incorrect scheduling of, very incorrect regulation of alcohol, which is far more dangerous than, or far more risky rather, than the regulations around it would suggest, that we will start to align policy with science rather than, what the drug war is based on, which is, inherently bias and fear.
So you know more about this than most people through your work at MAPS, but also with the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, is that, we kind of have this view of like, oh my gosh, yes, the scheduling, the drugs and the scheduling system is completely fucked, but, we don't know what to really do about it. I signed a petition here, I signed a petition there, people like maybe AOC in Brooklyn is a good person to have, but people really don't really understand what to do. What do we do? How do we get involved? How do we have this conversation in a way that is effective, that it's outside of our echo chamber? That's the thing. It happens so much within our echo chamber, but it's kind of not changing as fast as a lot of us would like to.
Yeah, it's it's really quite stunning. I'd like to sorry, hang on a second. It's not changing fast enough. That there's no question about it, but it is changing remarkably quickly, right? Yeah. And I would like to
I would, sorry, I'd want to take that back. It is changing. It is. I'm not, it's not changing it fast enough. Yeah.
But Zach, it's true. Like every day that these substances remain prohibited, more people are put in danger. The global business of drugs continues unabated. Drugs get stronger so that they can be packed into smaller areas. That, like, all of the problems of prohibition continue every single day that prohibition continues, and so it's never fast enough. And it's so much faster than so many of us thought it would be. Yeah. So when I first started out in cannabis policy reform, 35% of Americans believed that cannabis was medicine. And now that number is like such a vast majority that people who don't believe cannabis is medicine are like very few and far between, right? That was about a decade ago.
Okay, a decade.
Last month, the study came out that said 35% of Americans believe that psychedelics are medicine.
Wow, that's amazing.
So
yeah, that's a big number.
It's, we can get there, and I believe that we will. And also, it really does take having those conversations. It takes bringing the conversation out of the echo chamber and into your communities where people might not have an understanding of this. And listen, we've just had an enormous number of articles published that can help validate your what you believe in those conversations with your family, right? Yeah. So maybe grab that New York Times article, either of them from May, grab that Newsweek article, that Time article, that Scientific American article, and bring it to your mom and say, hey, have you seen this? Right? Hey, I know that, and listen, one of the hardest times to have this conversation is at the end of life, but we know that psilocybin at the end of life it can be an incredibly powerful palliative tool. You can bring some of the work around that to your family if it's getting to the point where you need to have some of those conversations and have that conversation about how things could be healthier or a little bit easier or a little less painful. Really having those conversations practice at the dinner table.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Right. So,
But I want to say one other thing too, is that, MAPS's policy department is doing a lot of work, particularly in California and in DC on Capitol Hill, to make sure that these issues are brought in front of legislators and policymakers. In many states, there are various initiatives that are ongoing. And so, figure out what's up in your state and who to talk to, have those conversations with your electeds. And people oftentimes discount the power of an opinion column in your local paper, but the people who read those, the people who read those opinion columns are the people who we need to be speaking to. So find that message that resonates for you, that's authentic, and bring that forward into your community in a way that feels safe and good.
So if I love everything that you just said. So fast forward however many years, let's say 10 years, and we have gone through this clinical trial and that clinical trial, and psychedelics have kind of graduated from that point. Where do you see organizations like MAPS operating in? What field are they operating in? Do they sort of transition into sort of like a lobbying kind of policy, social construct organization, or do they stay within the science? Like, what's next for something like MAPS?
Well, I think this is another place where we can look to cannabis as an example, right? Now, 25 years after the first medical cannabis, more than 25 years after the first medical cannabis state legislation was passed, we still don't have nearly enough research on its potential benefits. And I think that the opportunity to continue to do research, to continue to educate people, will long outlive the need to, get MDMA and psilocybin and LSD and ibogaine into the right schedules. And there will always be more, I think, conversations to be had. So whether that be academic or cultural, research oriented, or serious discussions about how we appropriately situate these substances in our lives, that will go on. And I think that MAPS work will continue in that realm. And certainly the Public Benefit Corporation has a long list of studies that we could be considering. Were the capacity there, were the fundamental work of MDMA for PTSD, MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD completed. So, and there's always room for improvement, right? If you look at the treatment protocols over the last 2 decades for MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, there is a continual improvement in that protocol and that treatment methodology. We're looking into ways to make it, more efficient, but just as effective as a cost control measure, right? 42 hours of therapy can be quite expensive, but what if it is just as effective for certain types of trauma when provided in group therapy? Well, that might mean we can help dozens more people at a time. We can magnify our impact if we're able to use group therapy. What are the other ways that psychedelics might benefit, psychotherapy and mental wellness? I think that there's much work to do after we simply get these substances properly situated in the Controlled Substances Act. Then it's a matter of continuing what I think will be a wellspring of research that will be available.
And, how do we, and, so much of the success of our achieving, these milestones and kind of looking at success really relies on so many people, quote unquote, coming out of the closet, if you will, whether it's, business professionals who say, hey, this helped me so much, it's safe, it inspired me to do this. I mean, much like how the Beatles said LSD helped them, LSD helped create Sgt. Pepper's, I mean, that's a very kind of a mundane but effective pop culture answer, that happened in the 60s. But we still see so many people in quote unquote the establishment, especially the medical establishment, who have a lot of, I guess, fear around this. What are their fears still based in? Are they just are they classist? Are they still tied into big pharma and the use of those kinds of drugs? I mean, how do we alleviate fear to kind of achieve these goals? Because it's really important.
Yeah, and we don't have to chalk it up to such nefarious notions of classism, racism, bias,
Sure,
and big pharma. Like, all of those may be factors, but also the hardest thing to fight is the status quo.
right.
Always.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if we're just thinking about normative experiences, what people anticipate, what people are used to, like, the hardest thing to fight is the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have to, I think, approach every conversation in a way that recognizes that, like, hey, maybe this person has misinformed ideas just because they've never had the opportunity to hear the reality. Now, that being said, I think it's really important to flag a couple of things here. People don't change their mind because of data, right? So when you're going in, yeah, I know.
Okay.
I myself like to think of myself as an evidence-based person, right?
Yeah.
But data doesn't change anybody's minds.
Okay. Yeah, you gotta help me with this one, because I say that a lot, and maybe I'm
yep. So, okay. I spoke earlier about how we built a team, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so when we're building our team is based on a set of shared beliefs, oftentimes in society, right? Our tribe, our people. And this is an old biological construct that has, since the beginning of tribe. And part of being in your tribe is sharing this set of beliefs. And so if you threaten a belief that someone holds deeply, and listen, this is Betty Reed's neurology news and then turns it into Betty language. This is not the science. I know there are a lot of scientists on your podcast who are probably who on and listen to your podcast, but this is Betty Reed's The Science and dumbs it down for Betty.
Awesome. Love it.
Okay, so we build our tribe, we have this set of beliefs, and beliefs based in fear are those that we hold most strongly, right? In those parts of our brain that are least responsive to data, to facts, to information. So the first thing that we have to do when we're trying to have a conversation with a person about a belief that they hold that is fear-based is get past that fear, right? And the best way, 50 some odd % of people have the strongest response, a stronger response, letting down their barriers, letting down their guard with story. So we have to start with a story. We have to start with a personal connection, right? We have to start with, this is a compelling thing that happened. I saw this person, or I healed this part of myself. I watched my loved one go through this therapy or have this experience. And through seeing that, I saw these things happen in their life that were positive, right? Starting with story breaks those fear centers down. And then the second thing that helps to break that kind of ingrained, primal belief system is questions. So it caused me to wonder, does this make sense that we are criminalizing people who use these substances? Or maybe could we see a better way? I started to wonder, does my understanding of drugs align with the science that's coming out? How do these things coexist? And then you get those questions rolling in a person's own head, and they start to really think about it and come to some sort of resolution on their own. And that's in that coming to resolution is when they're able to grapple with the data. When our brains allow us to take in new data, take in new information, and assess it appropriately. But if, you know, like I can stand up all day long and say 88% of people had a reduction in PTSD symptoms with MDMA-assisted therapy, and I can say that to every single person in my town.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, maybe 4 of them would believe me just based on the data. Very few people change their mind on data.
Right. It's a reality distortion field mechanism. I mean, we see it so happening in the political spectrum these days. I mean, we see this syndrome happening all the time when you have certain groups are in the far right or the far left are literally operating in a world of alternate realities, but they're convinced it's true.
Right. And facts don't matter.
Yeah.
So stories and questions, that's how you change people's minds. I also want to flag to here, Zach, before we jump on from this topic, that coming out of the closet about your personal use is a really, really important thing for people to do if they hold the privilege to do it. And not everyone does. There are many different ways that your life can be impacted, you know, child custody, employment, immigration status, housing. There are so many different, and familial relationships, right? So, you know, if you are thinking about talking to your family about your own personal use, maybe start with one of those articles and see how they respond. You know, if you're thinking about coming out, then really think about how that's going to impact your life, and might that be negative in a way that you can't undo.
Yes, so important. I've been really getting into. I watched that film Coded Bias on Netflix, which is about the algorithm Justice League. It's basically like how artificial intelligence is being engineered to be essentially racist and colorblind. How these algorithms are eliminating BIPOC communities and making them more vulnerable, but it factors directly into like child custody things, employment, and how this algorithm just behind the scenes, nobody knows how it works, but all of a sudden people are like losing their asylum petitions or losing their child custody hearings. And if you somehow come out of the closet and affects this algorithm in a way, highly dangerous.
Yeah, or if you if you tell your spouse or your ex about your use, and there is a possibility of child custody issues. If you are, if you post something on a social media site about your personal use, that might affect an immigration hearing, right? So we have to be careful about that.
And it's so like what you said about just disrupting the status quo, and people are afraid of that. I've always felt within psychedelics, and maybe I got this from a Terence McKenna book I read 25 years ago, but that people are afraid of mysticism. They're afraid of non-ordinary states of consciousness. Like if you benefited from something that is somehow outside of this normal construct we call reality, it's all automatically like, oh my God, that just sounds, scary, impossible, or fringe.
Sure. Or disruptive to your life.
Yeah.
Right. Especially if you are, if you have your life built around these social norms that you've heard other people talk about this mystical experience disrupting, right? That's going to be scary.
Right.
Of course.
And this kind of factors into what we were talking about earlier, but I wanted to ask it and pick it up again. It's sort of like this, I don't know, is psychedelic exceptionalism the same thing as sort of like ghettoizing psychedelics, in the sense that, we see so many things that are popping up that are very well intentioned, mind you, I want to put that out there. They're great people doing great work, but like things like psychedelics in recovery, and like I am in recovery and I love psychedelics and I think those are both great things, but psychedelics are no important to my recovery than say meditation is, or you know, or any sort of spiritual practice. And that we're somehow kind of pushing it aside and to create this community that is again the other, right? I mean, is this sort of like the same thing as psychedelic exceptionalism? Is that a syndrome of it?
That's a great question. I think that it's, I think that particularly for people who have some sort of like, let's see, this is such a good question. So this is such a good question because there is this, there are all of these shades in here of the importance of creating affinity groups, right, in order to have safe spaces, right?
Yes.
So for people in recovery, it might not always be safe to go to the big psychedelic party, right? Where perhaps people are using substances that they haven't, that a person is not prepared to be confronted by. You know, and you can see this in the workplace too, or in many other spaces where affinity groups create safe space for people to have conversations. And so I think I worry less about